So in this second video this week, what I want to talk about is research questions, methods, and the all-important observations. So the first thing is a research question. Research questions should be open-ended, specific, and focused, and they need to be answerable with available resources. And so you have to really take into account your rhetorical situation and your available resources to develop a good research question. But a lot of this is actually kind of intuitive, and you've already kind of been doing it your whole life. So one thing to keep in mind is research questions start as observations. So be curious. So a research question might be, hey, I noticed that there's a difference between this and this, even though they're usually put in the same category. So why? And then we phrase that as a more specific, open-ended, and focused question with, what are the differences? Why do those differences exist? So let's go through some made-up examples that might reflect your situation or would reflect someone else's situation in the course. So let's imagine we have a student named Joan, and she has noticed that she tends to get, on average, about one letter grade lower on her English papers than on her science or history papers. She just initially, and probably for most of her life, has just assumed that she's just not good at English. But then she was reading the readings that we've already done this month, or this semester, with G and Brandt and Scribner, and she realized that maybe there was something bigger going on. And since it's the same writer, then the writing technique isn't necessarily the problem, but the way the writing technique's being applied to the situation might be. So she has an observation. The same writer can be more successful in one subject than in another with the same writing style, even though at the surface level it would seem like the same writing style would be appropriate since they're all academic assignments. So Joan develops a question out of that. She says, why is she getting better grades for her style of writing in history and science classes than in English classes? And so she starts making some educated guesses, and these are her initial hypotheses. And so she says, well, maybe it's because she enjoys history and science more than she does English. But then she thinks, well, wait a second, maybe she enjoys it more because she's had more success in it. So maybe she's just enjoying the success. So she thinks maybe that's not the answer. Or maybe that answer can't be addressed in her research paper. But she's thinking about the readings, and she says, well, maybe there's different implied conventions in the English classes than in the history or science classes, and maybe Jones mastered the conventions for one, but not the other. Or maybe, if she wants to apply some of the terms, she says, well, maybe English is a different big D discourse, and she's fluent in big D discourse for her science classes, but not for her English classes, which would imply that there's a different identity toolkit being used here. Or she thinks maybe there's different implied values in English classes that translate into certain writing styles that are not the same as the implied values in science or history classes. So she thinks that might be worth investigating. So she's got all these different hypotheses, and now she can develop a better research question that's more generalizable and would produce a more interesting paper. Because simply answering why is she succeeding wouldn't necessarily help someone else who has a similar problem. So she has to make it in terms that would appeal to a broader audience just because of her rhetorical situation of doing this assignment for a formal paper. So she drafts up some questions. Her first research question that she drafts up that she might pursue is, how do writing conventions and expectations differ between typical English, history, and science assignments? And so we can already see a research method implied in here where she would need to collect assignment prompts and examine those assignment prompts. Or maybe she would collect her graded material and analyze the comments that she's gotten on it. Her second possible research question is very much related, but attacks it from a slightly different angle, where she says, how are typical English, history, and science course materials distinct from each other, and what values might be implied by those differences? Either of these research questions would be absolutely suitable for the assignment, and she'll revisit these research questions and constantly revise them as she finds more information and finds directions that are more or less interesting to her. For another example, we have an imaginary student, let's call him Justin, and he enjoys using social media such as Twitter and Instagram, and he carefully selects his hashtags to accompany his posts on each platform. But as he's been doing the reading, he's been wondering, well, how is it that he knows which hashtags he wants to use, or how to read other people's hashtags? So he gets curious about this. He says he's fluent in it, but at the same time, he can't really explain to someone else what the function of a hashtag is. And so you can be fluent in something, but not have that meta discursive knowledge where you can actually talk about it. So he wants to know, what is it doing? What is the function of a hashtag? So he makes some observations, and he says, well, okay, so they're used in a lot of different ways. So sometimes they're ironically used, where you kind of mean the opposite of what you've actually said in your hashtag. And that they sometimes appear both inside the main content of the post or at the end. And so he's also observing that people can understand this without too much confusion. And so he's wondering how that works. So he starts making notes of his observations, and he says, well, they generally appear at the end of the post unless they're part of the main content. So that looks like a convention. He finds that hashtags are used by users to find relevant or related posts. So you can just click on the hashtag and find posts that are similar. So it's an indexing system. He finds that they're used as a way of consciously boosting the post and making it more visible, so it has an advantage to the user. He also finds that different communities and demographics seem to be using hashtags in slightly different ways. And so he starts taking notes about what communities he's seeing use it in different ways. And he's also finding that hashtags are often used for activism or for asserting a specific identity. And so he's interested in how that works as well. So with that, he can create some research questions. So he comes up with this research question: how do different groups use trending hashtags to assert their own goals or values? That's a really interesting research question, but you also notice that with that how, it's actually very answerable. He can find more observations and start categorizing those observations. So that's one way you can approach developing your research questions. I'm out of time for this video, so I'm going to make another video that supplements this with research methods and descriptions of that.